My family spent a decade treating my career like a pathetic internet hobby. During our annual reunion, my perfect older sister stood up in front of 50 relatives and handed me a crumpled flyer for a $20 an hour pity job at her husband's firm just to humiliate me. I did not cry. I simply pulled out my phone, made one quiet call, and prepared to slide an $80 million bank statement across the linen tablecloth. I am Kenya, 35 years old. Before I share exactly how I bought the very country club we were standing in and fired my brother-in-law on the spot, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to remind your toxic family exactly who they are dealing with. The annual family reunion was always held at the Oakwood Country Club. It was a sprawling estate with manicured golf courses, crystal chandeliers, and vaulted ceilings that echoed with the sound of clinking silverware and forced laughter. My mother Vivian lived for this weekend. It was her personal stage to broadcast our family's supposed elite status to 50 extended relatives. She wore a tailored cream suit, her hair perfectly pressed, orchestrating the seating arrangements like a general preparing for battle. In her mind, we were the pinnacle of African American excellence. She had spent her entire adult life navigating Jack and Jill's social events, ensuring we attended the right schools and associated with the right people. But that strict standard only truly applied to my older sister, Gabby. Gabby sat across from me at the massive central dining table, dripping in pearls. She wore a salmon pink dress accented with apple green, making sure every aunt and uncle in the room remembered her Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority pedigree. She was a corporate lawyer, the undisputed golden child of the family, and she sat right next to her husband, Connor. Connor was a white wealth management executive who wore expensive boat shoes without socks and always spoke to our relatives with a polite, patronizing smile that set my teeth on edge. I sat quietly wearing a simple black dress, ignoring the side eyes from my aunts. For 10 years, I had been the family scapegoat. I skipped the traditional corporate path to build my own software company, a decision my parents treated like a criminal offense. They called it my little internet hobby. They told people I was finding myself. They never asked about my revenue, my clients, or my life. They only cared that I did not have a prestigious title they could brag about at Sunday dinner after church. The catering staff had just brought out the dessert course. A massive steaming tray of peach cobbler was placed in the center of our table. I reached for the heavy silver serving spoon, aiming to scoop a small portion onto my plate. Before my fingers could even graze the handle, my mother's hand shot out. Vivian snatched the serving spoon right out of my hand with a sharp, dismissive motion. She did not even look at me. She scooped a massive portion of the warm cobbler and placed it directly onto Gabby's gold-rimmed plate. "Let your sister eat first, Kenya," Vivian announced. Her voice was loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. The conversation around us dipped as relatives turned their heads to watch. Real professionals need their energy. Your little internet hobby can wait. You have nowhere important to be on a Monday morning anyway. The blatant disrespect hung in the air. A few of my younger cousins snickered behind their napkins. Uncle David cleared his throat and looked away. Gabby did not even have the grace to look embarrassed. She just smiled her perfectly whitened smile and took a deliberate bite of the cobbler, savoring the preferential treatment. I did not pull my hand back immediately. I let it hover in the empty space for a fraction of a second, committing the feeling to memory. I did not sigh. I did not roll my eyes. I simply picked up my water glass and took a slow, measured sip. The ice clinked softly against the crystal. "That is right," Vivian continued, adjusting her cream blazer as if nothing had happened. "We need to make sure Gabby and Connor are taken care of. They are dealing with millions of dollars of client assets every single day. We cannot have them running on empty." "What exactly are you doing these days anyway, Kenya? Still playing around on that computer in your apartment?" "I am managing my business, Mom," I said evenly. My voice was calm, completely devoid of the defensive tone they were so desperately trying to pull out of me. Gabby let out a sharp, condescending laugh. It sounded like shattering glass. "Business. Right." She wiped the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. "Actually, Kenya, I am so glad Mom brought this up. Connor and I were just talking about you on the drive over here. We are genuinely worried about your future. Gabby pushed her chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the polished hardwood floor. She stood up. The movement was calculated, designed to capture the attention of the entire room. 50 relatives paused their conversations. Forks hovered over plates. The string quartet playing softly in the corner suddenly seemed too loud. Gabby picked up her champagne flute and tapped it with her dessert spoon. "Family," Gabby announced, projecting her voice so it echoed off the vaulted ceilings. "If I could just have your attention for a moment. Connor and I have a small announcement." My father, Roland, puffed out his chest at the head of the table, beaming with absolute pride at his eldest daughter. "We all know how blessed Connor and I have been this year," Gabby continued, placing a manicured hand affectionately on Connor's shoulder. "His wealth management firm just posted record profits, and my law firm just made me a senior partner. But success means nothing if you do not lift up the people around you, especially family." She turned her gaze directly down at me. The condescension radiating from her eyes was heavy and suffocating. "Kenya, we know you have been struggling for a long time," Gabby said. Her voice dripped with fake sugary sympathy. "We know this little web design phase of yours has not panned out. Mom and Dad worry themselves sick about you having no real career, no health insurance, no stability. And frankly, it hurts me to see my little sister wasting her potential." She reached into her expensive designer handbag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out with her thumbs. It was wrinkled, clearly printed out as a hasty afterthought. She walked around the large dining table, her heels clicking rhythmically, until she stood right beside my chair. She slid the crumpled paper across the white linen tablecloth until it stopped right in front of my plate. It was a job flyer. The bold letters at the top read, "Front Desk Receptionist." "Connor's firm is expanding," Gabby announced to the silent room. "They need someone to answer phones, fetch coffee, and manage the visitor log. It pays $20 an hour. It comes with dental." We pulled some strings, and Connor convinced his human resources department to bypass the usual background checks. "We are offering you the job, Kenya. We want to save you from this wasted life." A heavy silence fell over the country club dining room. I could feel the collective gaze of 50 relatives burning into my skin. Aunt Shirley covered her mouth, masking a gasp. My cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. They were waiting for me to shatter. They were waiting for the scapegoat to cry, to yell, to storm out of the double doors in tears, proving once and for all that I was the unstable, unsuccessful burden they had always painted me to be. I looked down at the crumpled flyer. $20 an hour. A pity offer from a sister who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself. Vivian nodded enthusiastically from her seat. "You should say thank you, Kenya. This is a lifeline. You are 35 years old. It is time to join the real world and stop pretending you are some sort of tech mogul. Gabby is throwing you a rope. Grab it." I did not grab it. I did not speak. I sat perfectly still in my chair. My heart was beating in slow, measured thuds. I looked at Gabby's smug, victorious smile. I looked at my mother's harsh, judgmental glare. I looked at Connor, who was leaning back in his chair with a self-satisfied smirk, clearly enjoying his role as the white savior to his wife's tragic, failed sister. I did not cry. I did not argue. I just stared at them, letting the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. The tension in the air was so thick, it felt like static electricity against my skin. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought they had finally put me in my place. They had absolutely no idea what was about to happen. Connor took my silence as a sign of submission. He adjusted the crisp cuffs of his tailored blazer, shooting a knowing, triumphant glance at Gabby, before leaning across the vast expanse of the dining table. He rested his forearms on the white linen and laced his fingers together. When he spoke, he adopted the exact, soft, measured pitch a frustrated teacher uses to scold a slow, unruly child. "Kenya, I know this feels overwhelming," Connor said, offering a tight, practiced smile that did not reach his eyes. "I know the corporate world is a massive step up from running a little blog out of your living room. Wealth management is a serious industry. It is about projecting stability, competence, and absolute reliability. Our clients are high net worth individuals. They expect a certain standard of polish when they walk through our glass doors. He paused, letting his gaze drift pointedly toward my hair, currently styled in neat professional microlocks. The implication was loud, clear, and culturally violent. Gabby and I have discussed your situation at length, he continued, his voice echoing in the sudden quiet of the country club. We know things have been incredibly tight for you over the last decade. We do not want you showing up on Monday morning feeling out of place or intimidated by the environment. I am willing to personally advance you a week of pay right now. Call it a signing bonus. Use it to buy a modest, appropriate pantsuit. Maybe visit Gabby's stylist to get a proper silk press so you look the part. We want you to fit in, Kenya. We really are rooting for you. A collective murmur of approval swept through the dining room like a wave. Aunt Shirley leaned over her plate of roasted chicken and dabbed the corner of her eye with a napkin. She whispered loudly to my cousin about how truly blessed our family was to have such a generous, forgiving white man willing to overlook my obvious shortcomings. My father Roland nodded slowly from the head of the table, his chest puffed out with immense pride at his son-in-law's magnanimous charity. Vivian beamed, radiating the triumphant, glowing energy of a mother who had successfully orchestrated the rescue of her embarrassing, wayward daughter. They were feasting on my perceived failure. It was the main course of the reunion, far sweeter to them than the peach cobbler they had practically ripped from my hands. I sat perfectly still and let the murmurs wash over me for exactly 10 seconds. I did not break eye contact with Connor. I watched the smug satisfaction settle deep into the lines around his eyes. He fully believed he had just saved me. He fully believed he owned me, that he had purchased my dignity for $20 an hour and a forced trip to a hair salon. I reached into my designer bag. I did not pull out a tissue to wipe away tears. I did not pull out the crumpled flyer to hand it back to them in a fit of rage. I pulled out my phone. I unlocked the screen, tapped a single contact, and put the phone to my ear. The dining room fell dead silent once again. The relatives watched me with a mixture of confusion and rising irritation. Vivian opened her mouth, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to scold me for being disrespectful and taking a phone call at the dinner table during my own rescue intervention. I raised one index finger, silencing my mother instantly. Malik, I said when my chief financial officer answered the line. My voice was completely level, carrying effortlessly across the large room, slicing through the heavy tension. Cancel the merger delay. We go public on Monday morning. Execute the final paperwork immediately. I hung up the phone and slipped it back into my bag. Connor let out a short, breathy laugh, glancing sideways at Gabby as if to confirm I had finally suffered a complete psychological breakdown. Merger delay, he repeated, shaking his head with a mixture of pity and amusement. Kenya, what kind of performance is this? You do not need to invent imaginary business deals to save face in front of us. We are family. We are trying to pull you out of the gutter. I ignored him entirely. I reached back into my bag and pulled out my wallet. From the premium leather slot, I extracted a solid titanium American Express Centurion card. It was matte black, physically heavy, and absolutely unmistakable to anyone who worked in high-level finance. I placed my index finger on the center of the card and slid it slowly across the linen tablecloth. The heavy metal made a distinct, hard scraping sound before coming to a complete stop directly on top of the crumpled $20 an hour job flyer Gabby had presented to me. Put the entire family's catering tab for the weekend on this, I said, leaning forward to mirror Connor's earlier posture. Since I am freeloading on your dime. Connor stared at the table, his eyes locked onto the black metal. As a wealth management executive, he knew exactly what the financial requirements were for an invitation to hold that specific card. He knew the initiation fee alone was more than his annual performance bonus. He knew the minimum annual spending requirements were in the tens of millions of dollars. He knew that the card sitting on top of his pitiful job offer was not handed out to receptionists. I watched in real time as his brain tried to process the impossible contradiction between the failed sister-in-law he had just attempted to dress down and the titanium reality sitting inches from his plate. The smug, patronizing smile vanished completely from his face. All the color drained from his cheeks, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. He looked from the black card up to my face, his mouth opening, but absolutely no sound coming out. The heavy silence shattered. The clinking of fine silverware was completely replaced by the frantic buzzing of whispers from the 50 relatives gathered around the room. Aunt Shirley leaned so far across the table, her silk sleeve dipped right into the gravy boat. She loudly whispered to my cousin, asking if that was one of those fake metal cards people bought online to look rich. The whispers grew into a low, chaotic rumble. Everyone was staring at the black rectangle sitting on the white linen. Connor picked up the card. He turned it over in his hands. His knuckles were bone white. He worked in wealth management. He knew exactly what he was holding. He knew the initiation fee alone was $10,000. He knew the strict invitation-only spending requirements were astronomical. And he knew his own firm had rejected his application for this exact card just last year. The realization that the black woman he had just offered a $20 an hour receptionist job was holding a Centurion card fractured his fragile reality. He could not process it. His brain simply refused to accept that I could possess something he coveted so deeply. He tossed the card back onto the table. It landed with a heavy metallic clack that silenced the whispers of the relatives nearby. He forced a laugh, but his voice was an octave too high, strained and brittle. "Whose name is actually on this, Kenya?" Connor asked loudly. His tone was no longer that of a generous benefactor. It was the sharp, accusatory bark of a man trying to regain control of a room slipping from his grasp. "Because this is not a toy. If you found this or if you lifted it from one of the clients you do freelance web design for, you are committing a federal offense." Gabby crossed her arms. Her apple-green nails tapped aggressively against her wine glass. She looked at the card, then glared at me, her eyes filled with a toxic mixture of jealousy and sheer disbelief. "Connor is right," Gabby snapped. "Identity theft is a felony, Kenya. I am a corporate lawyer. I am not going to sit here in a rented country club and watch you implicate this entire family in a federal financial crime just because you want to show off and act important at a family reunion. You have always been desperate for attention, but this is crossing a legal line." I sat perfectly still. I did not raise my voice. I did not rush to defend myself. I simply looked at Gabby and Connor, letting them dig their graves with their own mouths. Their refusal to believe in my success was so deeply ingrained that they immediately jumped to grand larceny, rather than accept that I had outgrown their pity. Connor leaned closer. The veins in his neck were pulsing against his stiff collar. He placed his hands flat on the table, trying to tower over me. "Or maybe you did not steal it," Connor said. His voice dropped, taking on a sudden vicious and deeply insulting implication. "Maybe you found yourself a generous benefactor, a wealthy older man who lets you swipe his plastic as long as you keep quiet and play nice. Is that what your little internet hobby really is, Kenya? Are you running some kind of digital escort service?" The entire dining room gasped. My mother Vivian clutched the lapels of her cream suit. But nobody defended me. Not a single aunt, uncle, or cousin told Connor he was out of line for accusing his wife's sister of being a fraudulent mistress or an escort. They just waited eagerly for my response, perfectly willing to consume my downfall as the evening's main entertainment. They wanted me to yell. They wanted me to scream and throw my drink so they could call me an angry, unhinged woman. I smiled. It was a cold, empty smile. That was when my father, Roland, reached his boiling point. Roland was the ultimate patriarch of our family. He had built a modest construction supply business and carried himself like he was the king of our city. He valued respectability politics above his own children. He cared more about what the wealthy white men at his Rotary Club thought of him than he cared about the truth. To him, my silence was defiance, and my card was a threat to the established order of his household. Roland slammed his heavy fist down on the dining table. The crystal water glasses rattled violently. Water sloshed over the rims and soaked into the linen. "That is enough!" Roland bellowed. The sheer volume of his voice made Aunt Shirley jump in her seat. He pointed a thick, calloused finger directly at my face, completely ignoring the blatant disrespect Connor had just thrown at me. "You always were a liar," Kenya Rowland shouted, "always trying to take the shortcut, always trying to act like you are bigger than you are. Just like when you lied about getting that full academic scholarship to that historically black college just to avoid working the dispatch desk at my supply yard." I looked at him feeling absolutely nothing. I had not lied about the university scholarship. 10 years ago, he had simply refused to provide his tax returns for my financial aid forms because he did not want the government looking too closely at his business deductions. His refusal had forced me to forfeit the money and drop out, leaving me to build my software company entirely from the ground up while working night shifts. But I did not correct him. I let him rewrite our history in front of everyone, knowing exactly what was coming next. "You are embarrassing us," Roland continued, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of the dining room. "You are embarrassing your mother. You are embarrassing your sister. And you are disrespecting Connor, a successful man who just tried to throw you a lifeline. You walk in here flashing stolen plastic, making up stories about going public and insulting the people who put food on your table." Roland stood up, kicking his chair back. He pointed at the black card, then pointed at Connor. "Apologize to your brother-in-law right now," Roland demanded. "Apologize to him and tell the truth about where you got that card before he calls the police and ruins this family's good name. I will not have you dragging us into a criminal investigation because of your desperate need to look important." The room was dead silent again. 50 pairs of eyes stared at me, waiting for me to break. Waiting for the apology, waiting for the confession they were so certain was coming. Connor stood taller, a triumphant smirk returning to his face. He felt perfectly protected by the family patriarch. He truly believed he had won. Connor straightened his posture, feeding instantly off my father's booming defense. He reached out and tapped the heavy titanium card with his manicured fingernail, treating it like a piece of counterfeit evidence in a courtroom. "I appreciate the support," Roland Connor said, using my father's first name with that familiar, unwarranted ease he always deployed. "But as an executive at a top-tier wealth management firm, I have a fiduciary duty to report financial irregularities. If your daughter is carrying stolen property or laundering money for some illicit enterprise, I cannot just look the other way. My firm manages 9-figure portfolios for the most elite families in this state. I will not have my reputation compromised because Kenya wants to play pretend at a family gathering." Connor unzipped his imported leather messenger bag resting against the leg of his chair. He pulled out a sleek silver iPad Pro and placed it squarely on the table. "I have top-level administrative clearance to our global wealth registry and federal background databases," Connor announced. His voice was loud, projecting across the dining room to ensure every aunt, uncle, and cousin understood his authority. "It flags shell companies' fraudulent credit lines and offshore accounts instantly. It is the same software we use to vet venture capitalists before we allow them into our portfolios. I will run the serial numbers attached to this card right now. We will see exactly whose name is on that account, and then I will be making a call to the authorities." Gabby leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. She looked around at the younger cousins seated at the adjacent tables, her face set in a mask of stern, sisterly disappointment. "I want all of you younger girls to pay very close attention to this," Gabby said, projecting her voice like a seasoned trial lawyer delivering a closing argument. "This is exactly what happens when you try to fake the lifestyle of a real professional. You cannot skip the hard work, the late nights studying for the bar exam, the networking, and just expect to sit at the adults' table. This is a teaching moment. Watch what happens when a lie catches up to you." I did not break my gaze away from Connor. I reached out and wrapped my hand around my crystal glass of iced sweet tea. The condensation was cold against my skin. I lifted the glass and took a slow, deliberate sip. I set the glass back down exactly where it was. "Run it," I said. My voice was steady, cutting through the stifling air of the country club. Connor paused, his fingers hovering over the glass screen. He looked at me, clearly expecting me to crack, to snatch the card back, to beg him not to humiliate me in front of Roland and Vivian. I leaned back in my chair and crossed my legs. Run the card, Connor, I repeated. Run my full legal name. And while you are logged into your elite global wealth registry, I suggest you run the holding company registered directly to me. Type in KEdutech. Connor scoffed, shaking his head as he tapped his passcode into the tablet. Educational technology. He sneered, his fingers moving rapidly across the digital keyboard. Please. You probably sell PDF planners on Instagram or run a drop shipping scam. You do not even know what a real holding company looks like. Vivian let out a loud theatrical sigh, adjusting the pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. She looked at me with pure, unfiltered exhaustion. Just show her the zero balance, Connor, Vivian demanded. Show the entire family the truth so we can finally eat this peach cobbler in peace. She has dragged this ridiculous stunt out long enough. She is just trying to ruin your sister's celebration because she has nothing of her own. Expose the lie and let us move on. The sound of Connor typing was the only noise left in the room. The string quartet in the far corner of the venue had finished their piece, and the resulting silence in the dining area was heavy and absolute. 50 relatives held their breath. No one shifted in their seats. No one clinked a fork against a plate. They were all completely fixated on the bright glow of the iPad screen illuminating Connor's face. He swiped his finger across the glass. The screen flashed bright white as the database loaded the query. I watched the exact moment his reality fractured. Connor squinted, leaning closer to the screen as if the harsh glare of the country club chandeliers was playing tricks on his eyes. He tapped the screen again, harder this time. He swiped down, refreshing the page. He tapped a specific line of data, opening a secondary window within his firm's secure portal. His breath hitched. It was a sharp, audible gasp that carried across the table. The color vanished from Connor's face in a single, terrifying instant. His skin turned the shade of old parchment. He tried to set the iPad down on the table, but his hands began to shake violently. The aluminum edge of the tablet clattered against his crystal water goblet, spilling ice onto the linen cloth. He gripped the edges of the device, his knuckles turning white as he stared at the glowing numbers. Gabby noticed the immediate physical shift in her husband. She uncrossed her arms, her perfectly shaped eyebrows pulling together in annoyance. "What is it?" Gabby snapped, irritated that he was not instantly parading my failure to the room. "Why are you shaking? Just turn the screen around and show them the fraud alert. Turn it around, Connor." Connor completely ignored his wife. He did not turn the screen around. He looked up slowly, his eyes locking onto mine. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords refused to produce a single sound. The arrogant white savior persona that had dictated his every interaction with me for the past 5 years completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, unadulterated panic that paralyzed him in his seat. Connor's fingers gave out. The sleek silver iPad slipped from his trembling hands and clattered heavily onto the table, knocking over his crystal water goblet. The ice water spilled across the white linen, soaking into the sleeves of his expensive blazer, but he did not even flinch. He just sat there staring at me as if I had suddenly turned into a ghost. Gabby rolled her eyes, let out a sharp sigh of annoyance, and snatched the iPad from the puddle of water. "Connor, honestly, pull yourself together. Let me see what kind of fake shell company she..." Gabby's voice died in her throat. Her perfectly manicured fingernails dug into the edges of the tablet. Her eyes darted back and forth across the screen, reading the data once, twice, 3 times. The arrogant smirk that had been plastered on her face all evening completely melted away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. "What does it say, Gabby?" my father Roland demanded from the head of the table. He leaned forward, his patience entirely exhausted. "Read it out loud so we can put an end to this nonsense." Gabby swallowed hard. She looked at Connor, who was still paralyzed, and then looked at me. "It says KEdutech," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "It says the CEO and sole proprietor is Kenya." "We already knew the name of her little internet blog," Roland barked. "What is the valuation? 0. "No, Dad," Gabby said, her voice shaking now. She placed the iPad flat on the table and pushed it slowly toward him. "It says KEdutech has a current valuation of $85 million, but that is not all." Gabby looked at her husband. Her eyes were wide with genuine terror. Connor, tell me this database is glitching. Please tell me this is a system error. Connor finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a hollow, defeated rasp. It is not a glitch, he whispered. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and interlaced my fingers. I looked directly into Connor's pale, terrified face. Go ahead, Connor, I said smoothly. Read the rest of the corporate hierarchy for the family. Tell them exactly what else K-Edutech owns as of Friday afternoon. The entire dining room was so quiet, I could hear the hum of the air conditioning unit. Connor opened his mouth, closed it, and looked down at his lap. He could not bring himself to say the words. Since my brother-in-law seems to have lost his voice, I will explain, I announced to the room. My voice was clear and unwavering. Over the past 5 years, K-Edutech evolved from an educational software startup into a major holding group. 48 hours ago, we finalized the acquisition of a boutique wealth management firm that had been struggling with insolvency. We bought it for $22 million in cash. I paused, letting my eyes drift over to my sister. That firm is Vanguard Financial, Connor's firm. Aunt Shirley gasped so loudly she choked on her breath. My younger cousins exchanged wild, wide-eyed glances. Roland stared at me, his jaw slack, the heavy fist he had slammed on the table moments ago, now resting uselessly by his plate. That is impossible, Roland muttered, shaking his head. Connor is a senior vice president. He would know if his firm was being sold. Senior vice presidents at the regional level are not informed of parent company acquisitions until the ink is completely dry and the public announcement is made. I explained calmly, keeping my gaze locked on Connor. The public announcement goes out on Monday morning. I plan to come into the office on Tuesday to personally evaluate the executive staff. I picked up the crumpled job flyer Gabby had thrown at me earlier. I smoothed out the wrinkles and held it up. You offered me a $20 an hour job answering your phones, I said, my voice dripping with cold precision. You wanted to advance me a week of pay out of your own pocket so I could buy a cheap pantsuit and straighten my hair to fit your corporate standards. You sat there and mocked me in front of 50 people, completely unaware that you were insulting the person who now owns your entire firm. I am not a receptionist, Connor. I am your new boss. Connor looked like he was going to be sick. He reached for his napkin and wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead. Kenya, please. He stammered, his arrogant tone entirely replaced by desperate pleading. I was just trying to help. We are family. I did not know. You did not know because you never bothered to ask, I replied. None of you did. You all spent the last 10 years treating me like a failure because I did not fit your narrow, outdated definition of success. You needed a scapegoat so Gabby could feel superior. Well, the game ends tonight. I stood up from my chair. The movement sent a ripple of anxiety through the relatives seated nearby. I reached into my bag and pulled out my corporate folder. Connor, your performance metrics over the last 2 quarters have been abysmal, I stated, pulling out a sheet of paper. I reviewed your file on the flight here. You lose more clients than you bring in, and your management style is outdated. As the new owner of Vanguard Financial, my first executive decision was going to be a severe restructuring of your department. I looked down at him. He was visibly shrinking in his seat, the reality of his impending unemployment crashing down on him. I opened my mouth to deliver the final blow, to fire him right there in front of the audience he had tried to weaponize against me. Before I could speak the words, the sound of a chair scraping aggressively against the hardwood floor echoed through the room. My mother, Vivian, stood up. She did not look shocked. She did not look embarrassed by her son-in-law's humiliation. She looked remarkably calm. Her face was a mask of cold, calculated precision as she smoothed the front of her cream blazer. Put the paperwork away, Kenya, Vivian commanded. Her voice lacked its usual theatrical pitch. It was low, hard, and terrifyingly steady. I paused, narrowing my eyes at her. This is a corporate matter, Mom. You do not have a say in what I do with my company. Vivian offered a tight, chilling smile. She walked slowly around the table until she was standing directly behind Roland, placing her hands firmly on his shoulders. You really think you are the smartest person in the room, do you not? Vivian said, looking at me with absolute ice in her eyes. You think you can just march in here, humiliate your sister's husband, and play the triumphant billionaire? You think you built that little empire all by yourself? She shook her head slowly. It does not matter how much that holding company is worth, Kenya, Vivian announced, dropping a bombshell that sucked the remaining oxygen out of the country club. By law, this family owns 50% of it anyway. The sheer audacity of my mother's statement hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. For a split second, the only sound was the clinking of ice melting in Connor's overturned water glass. Then the whispers erupted again, a tidal wave of scandalized murmurs from the 50 relatives who had just witnessed the entire power dynamic of the Wilson family flip on its head only to be thrown into a blender. Roland did not hesitate. The patriarch in him, obsessed with respectability and terrified of public shame, snapped into action. He slammed his hand on the table one last time, standing up to his full height. He commanded the room to clear out. He told Aunt Shirley, the cousins, and the extended family that the reunion dinner was officially over, citing a private, sensitive financial matter that needed immediate containment. There were protests, of course. Aunt Shirley lingered by the dessert cart, desperate for more details, but Roland barked an order that sent her scurrying. Within minutes, the catering staff was dismissed. The extended family was ushered into the grand foyer of the country club. Roland walked to the entrance of the private dining room, grabbed the brass handles of the heavy mahogany double doors, and pulled them shut. The locks engaged with a solid, definitive click. We were entirely alone. The core family. The gloves were officially off. I remained standing at my end of the table, my corporate folder still resting under my fingertips. I looked at the 4 people who shared my blood but had never acted like my family. Connor was wiping his face with a linen napkin, still reeling from the realization that his employment status rested in my hands. Gabby had uncrossed her arms and was leaning forward, her eyes darting between me and our parents. The sheer panic that had gripped her moments ago was slowly being replaced by a sickening, hopeful realization. I turned my attention entirely to my mother. Vivian stood next to Roland, her posture immaculate, her chin raised in that familiar aristocratic tilt she used whenever she felt she had the upper hand. Explain exactly what you mean by 50%, I demanded, my voice sharp and uncompromising. I incorporated K-Edutech as a sole proprietorship. I funded it with my own money. I built it from a single laptop in a studio apartment while you were busy telling your Rotary Club friends I was a lost cause. You have zero legal claim to my company. Roland walked slowly back to his chair at the head of the table. He did not look ashamed. He did not look like a father who had just been caught in a monstrous lie. He looked like a businessman negotiating a hostile takeover. Sit down, Kenya, Roland ordered, pointing a thick finger at my chair. You are acting like a child throwing a tantrum. You think you are the only one in this room who understands corporate structures. We are your parents. We did what was necessary to protect the legacy of this family. I did not sit. I crossed my arms and waited. Vivian stepped forward, placing a manicured hand on the back of Gabby's chair. 5 years ago, Vivian began, her voice completely devoid of any maternal warmth. Your sister was in trouble. Real trouble. The kind of trouble that ruins a family's reputation permanently. Gabby looked down at the tablecloth, suddenly pretending to find the weave fascinating. The golden child, the perfect corporate lawyer, was squirming. Gabby's prestigious private law practice was failing, Roland interjected, taking over the narrative with a heavy dose of patriarchal justification. She had overextended herself. She took on bad clients. She mismanaged her escrow accounts. She was facing total bankruptcy, Kenya. And not just Chapter 11. She was facing a potential disbarment investigation if she could not cover the massive deficit in her operating budget. I stared at my sister, the perfect Alpha, Kappa Alpha pedigree. The woman who had just 15 minutes ago handed me a crumpled flyer for a $20 an hour receptionist job because she claimed to pity my unstable lifestyle. She had been secretly drowning in debt and professional disgrace while mocking my quiet, steady grind. We could not let that happen, Vivian said, squeezing Gabby's shoulder affectionately. Gabby is the face of this family's success. She is a lawyer. She married an executive. We could not let her lose everything. Roland needed to secure a massive federal business loan to bail her out and cover the firm's deficit before the State Bar Association caught wind of the missing funds. "And what does bailing out your golden child's failed law firm have to do with my software company?" I asked, though the sickening reality of their crime was already beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. Roland sighed, leaning back in his chair as if explaining simple math to an idiot. "My construction assets were already leveraged, Kenya. The federal loan required clean, unencumbered collateral. It required a guarantor, a business entity with zero existing debt that could co-sign the financial liability. We needed a shell company to absorb the risk on paper so the bank would release the funds to save Gabby." I felt the blood roaring in my ears. "You used my company." "We assumed your little internet hobby was dead anyway," Vivian said, waving her hand dismissively. "You never talked about it. You never showed us any profits. You were living in a shoebox apartment. We figured K-Edutech was just a worthless inactive LLC taking up space on a state registry." So Roland had his attorneys draft the paperwork. "You forged my signature," I stated. The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. It was not a question. It was a terrifying realization of the depths of their depravity. Gabby finally looked up, her eyes flashing with defensive anger. "I am a real lawyer, Kenya," she snapped entirely, missing the irony of her statement given her near disbarment. "My career actually mattered to this family. We did what families do to survive." Dad's lawyers structured the guarantor agreement. To satisfy the federal underwriters, the paperwork stipulated that Roland's family trust was granted a 50% equity stake in K-Edutech in exchange for utilizing the LLC as the backing entity. "You signed over half of my company to yourselves using a forged signature to secure a fraudulent federal loan," I said, carefully enunciating every single word so there was absolutely no room for misunderstanding. "You committed federal bank fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft to cover up Gabby's embezzlement. We saved your sister," Roland boomed, his face flushing red with sudden anger. "And frankly, it is the only reason your little company is worth anything today. If we had not tied it to that federal loan, you never would have had the financial backing to scale it. You owe us, Kenya. By law, my trust owns half of that $85 million valuation. And since you just purchased Vanguard Financial, my trust effectively owns half of Connor's firm as well." Connor, who had been sitting in stunned silence, suddenly sat up straight. The realization that his father-in-law now technically owned half of the company that had just fired him sent a visible jolt of adrenaline through his system. The panic in his eyes was instantly replaced by a predatory gleam. He looked at Roland, then looked at me, a sickening alliance forming between the two men who had just realized they could legally plunder my decade of hard work. "This changes everything," Connor said, his voice regaining its arrogant edge. "If Roland's trust holds a 50% equity stake, then your executive authority is severely compromised, Kenya. You cannot fire me. You cannot restructure Vanguard Financial without a majority board vote, and right now the board is tied." Vivian smiled her cold, triumphant smile. She walked over to where I was standing and looked me up and down with absolute disdain. "You are going to transfer $42.5 million into your father's trust account by the end of the business day tomorrow," Vivian stated, "or we will take this to civil court. We will freeze every single asset K-Edutech holds. We will freeze the Vanguard acquisition. We will tie you up in litigation for the next decade until your little empire bleeds dry." You wanted to sit at the adults' table, Kenya. This is how the adults play. They looked at me with absolute certainty. They believed they had me trapped. They believed their monstrous betrayal, their 5-year-old forgery, had successfully cornered me into handing over half of my life's work to subsidize their golden child's failures. They expected me to panic, to cry, or to beg them to reconsider. Instead, I looked at Roland's smug face, then at Gabby's victorious sneer, and finally at Connor's revived arrogance. I slowly reached back into my designer bag. I did not pull out a checkbook. I did not pull out a tissue. I pulled out a thick, sealed manila envelope adorned with the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I smiled. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room clicked shut with a resounding final thud. Roland engaged the deadbolt, sealing us inside. The soft ambient music from the main dining hall was instantly muffled, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the sharp clinking of ice melting in Connor's overturned water glass. The extended family had been swiftly ushered out, banished to the grand foyer under the guise of a private financial discussion. We were completely alone, the core family. The audience was gone and the masks had been utterly discarded. The gloves were officially off. I stood at my end of the vast dining table, my fingertips resting lightly on the leather portfolio I had pulled from my bag. I stared at the woman who gave birth to me. The absolute lack of remorse in Vivian's eyes was chilling. 50%. They had stolen my identity, bound my company to a massive federal loan, and now they were using that very crime as a weapon to extort me. Roland walked slowly back to his chair at the head of the table. He did not look ashamed. He did not look like a father who had just been caught committing a monstrous felony against his own flesh and blood. He looked like a ruthless businessman negotiating a hostile takeover. He pulled out his chair, sat down heavily, and steepled his thick fingers. Your grandmother. Big Mama made a massive mistake when she left you that seed money, Roland began. His voice rumbled with undeniable, suffocating authority. She was always too sentimental for her own good. She saw you struggling with that useless art degree, jumping from one failed freelance gig to another, and she thought throwing cash at you would somehow fix your fundamental lack of direction. But your mother and I knew better. He gestured dismissively toward me. We saw you sitting in that cramped, run-down apartment. We knew you were just staring at computer screens day and night, pretending to be some sort of CEO of a company that generated zero real-world value. You were wasting that inheritance, Kenya. You were throwing it down a digital drain. I kept my expression entirely neutral, betraying absolutely none of the rage boiling in my veins. So you decided to steal it, I stated evenly. We reallocated it, Vivian corrected sharply. She stepped up to stand directly beside my father, resting a manicured hand on his shoulder in a display of unified parental dominance. We put that money into Gabby's real career. Your sister had a physical office downtown. She had actual staff on payroll. She had a mortgage in a gated community and a pristine reputation to uphold. That is what family does, Kenya. We protect our investments. We ensure the strongest among us do not fall. Gabby nodded enthusiastically, her confidence fully restored by our parents' ruthless defense. She reached over and placed her hand intimately over Connor's. I was facing a temporary cash flow issue. Gabby said, her tone light, completely downplaying the reality of her near disbarment. It happens to the best law firms. Mom and Dad simply did what was necessary to bridge the financial gap and keep my practice afloat. By committing federal forgery, I repeated, making sure the reality of their actions remained at the absolute forefront of the conversation. You forged my signature on federal banking documents. You bound my LLC, which I built entirely with my own hands, to your massive debt. And thank God we did, Roland boomed, leaning forward so far, his chest pressed against the table edge. Because look at what it did for you. If we had not tied your little startup to that federal loan, you never would have had the financial scaffolding to scale it. You think you built an $85 million holding company on your own merit. You built it on the back of my credit, Kenya. My signature pushed that loan through. My connections got the bank underwriters to accept your worthless LLC as a guarantor. By law, my family trust owns half of everything you have, half of the holding company, half of the Vanguard financial acquisition. Connor let out a long, ragged breath he had clearly been holding for minutes. His tense shoulders finally dropped, and a sickening, relieved smile spread across his face. The realization that he was protected by this grotesque family conspiracy filled him with renewed, venomous arrogance. Which means you do not have the unilateral authority to fire me, Connor said, his voice dripping with his trademark white savior condescension. You cannot make a single executive change at Vanguard Financial without a majority vote from the board of directors. And since Roland controls 50% of your parent company, the board is deadlocked. You are stuck with me, Kenya. Connor leaned back, crossing his arms and crossing his legs, perfectly comfortable once again. In fact, given my extensive experience in high-level wealth management, Roland and Vivian have already agreed that I should step in as the Chief Operating Officer of K-Edutech. We need an experienced hand to guide this kind of capital. You clearly lack the corporate maturity to handle $85 million. I looked at the four of them in sheer disbelief. They had constructed an entire alternate reality where their felony theft was actually a generous favor, and my decade of grueling success was their rightful property. "You are attempting to blackmail me," I said, my voice eerily calm in the face of their extortion. "We prefer to call it a family partnership agreement," Vivian replied smoothly. She walked over to the wooden sideboard, poured herself a glass of sparkling water, and took a delicate sip. "You are going to transfer $42.5 million into your father's trust account by the end of the business day tomorrow. You are going to formally appoint Connor as your chief operating officer. And in exchange, we will not tear your company apart in civil court. And if I refuse," I asked, tilting my head slightly, "if I take this directly to the authorities and report the forgery?" Roland let out a deep, booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. It was the sound of a man completely convinced of his own invincibility. "You will not do that," Roland said, shaking his head with an amused smirk. "Because you know exactly what that means. If you report the forgery, you trigger an immediate federal investigation. The bank will call in the massive loan. Gabby will be instantly disbarred and face severe embezzlement charges, and your mother and I will be indicted for federal bank fraud." He leaned across the table, his eyes locked onto mine, daring me to challenge his authority. "Are you going to send your own parents to federal prison, Kenya? Are you going to put your mother in a concrete cell just because you want to be greedy? You have $85 million. You have more than enough to share with the people who raised you. If you blow the whistle, you destroy this entire family. You will be the villain for the rest of your life. Nobody will ever speak to you again." Gabby chimed in, her voice dripping with toxic, manipulative sweetness. "Think about what you are doing, Kenya. We are your blood. You have always been so angry, so bitter about my success. But now you finally have a chance to prove you actually belong in this family. Just sign the partnership agreement. We can all walk away rich and happy." They smiled. The four of them stood there in the locked, soundproofed private dining room, fully believing they had executed the perfect trap. They thought my morality, my desperate childhood need for their approval, and my deep-seated fear of destroying the family name would force me to surrender my empire. They thought they held the absolute keys to my kingdom. They thought the threat of sending my own parents to federal prison was the ultimate deterrent. They had fundamentally misunderstood the woman standing in front of them. Gabby stepped away from Connor and moved to the center of the room. The transition was instantaneous. She dropped the panicked sister routine and slipped seamlessly into the arrogant, cutthroat courtroom persona that had supposedly made her a senior partner. She smoothed her hands down her salmon-pink skirt, adjusted her pearls, and looked at me with the cold, detached gaze of a predator evaluating its prey. "Let us strip away the emotion for a second and look at the objective legal reality," Gabby said. Her voice was sharp, projecting off the mahogany panels. "You claim the signature was forged. That is a cute narrative, Kenya, but in civil court, a narrative is entirely worthless without years of expensive, grueling discovery. The document exists. It is notarized. It is filed with the state. On paper, Roland's Trust owns 50% of your company." She began to pace slowly behind the heavy wooden chairs, her heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. It was a calculated intimidation tactic designed to make me feel small, cornered, and entirely at her mercy. "If you refuse to honor the partnership agreement, I will file an injunction first thing Tuesday morning." Gabby continued, her tone dripping with absolute certainty. "I will tie your assets up in probate and civil court for a decade. I will file an emergency motion to freeze the Vanguard financial acquisition, citing a dispute in corporate ownership. I will drag you through depositions until you cannot afford to keep the lights on at your shiny new headquarters. We will bleed K-Edutech completely dry." Connor crossed his arms, leaning back against the wall with a smug, deeply satisfied smile. Roland nodded approvingly, beaming at his eldest daughter's ruthlessness. They were a unified front of extortion, fully believing that their collective power could easily crush me. "But we are reasonable people," Gabby said, stopping her pacing and resting her hands on the back of my father's chair. "We do not actually want to destroy your business. We just want what we are owed for saving you from your own lack of capital." $10 million. She let the number hang in the air, waiting for me to gasp or recoil. $10 million liquid transferred into Roland's trust account by the end of the business day tomorrow. Gabby specified, her eyes locking onto mine with absolute malice. "In exchange, the trust will sign a comprehensive release of all claims against K-Edutech and the Vanguard acquisition. You get to keep your company and your title, and you get to walk out of here knowing you finally contributed something of value to this family. Refuse, and I promise you, I will make the rest of your professional life a living nightmare." I did not interrupt her. I sat in my chair and listened to every single word. I let her finish her entire legal threat, savoring the absolute height of her unearned confidence. I watched the triumphant smiles solidify on their faces. They thought I was trapped. They thought my silence was the sound of my submission. I reached out and picked up my glass of iced tea, taking a slow, refreshing sip. The ice clinked against the crystal. I set the glass down, uncrossed my legs, and leaned forward. "You are a terrible lawyer, Gabby," I said softly. The confident smirk vanished from her face, replaced by a flash of immediate defensive outrage. "Excuse me," she snapped. "You heard me?" I replied, my voice completely devoid of the fear she so desperately wanted to see. A competent corporate lawyer would have conducted basic due diligence before attaching their name to a fraudulent guarantor agreement. A competent lawyer would have actually checked the status of the LLC they were attempting to hijack. You assumed K-Edutech was just a dead, worthless hobby. You assumed I was doing absolutely nothing. I reached into my designer bag and pulled out the thick manila folder I had been waiting to use. It was heavy, packed with certified documents. I untied the string closure and slid the first stack of papers across the polished mahogany table. 5 years ago, K-Edutech was not a dead LLC, I explained, watching Gabby's eyes drop to the documents. 5 years ago, I had just secured my first major round of funding. Not from venture capitalists, from the federal government. I won a highly competitive multi-million-dollar Department of Education grant to develop software for underfunded public school districts. The color began to drain from Gabby's face. Her eyes darted rapidly across the first page, reading the official government letterheads. "Do you understand what that means, Gabby?" I asked, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the room. "It means my company was operating under strict federal oversight. Our financial structure, our equity distribution, and our guarantor status were all federally regulated and audited." I pulled out the next document. It was a copy of the loan agreement they had forged, highlighting the signature page. I slid it right next to the federal grant contracts. "You did not just forge a signature on a dead LLC to get a local bank loan," I stated, leaning in close. "You attached your name, your law firm, and your state bar number to a federally regulated education contract. You committed fraud against an entity actively funded by the United States government." Roland's imposing posture suddenly collapsed. He slumped back into his chair, his chest heaving as he stared at the papers. Connor pushed himself off the wall, his mouth hanging open in silent horror. Gabby reached out with a trembling hand and touched the forged document. "Kenya," she whispered, her voice completely stripped of its arrogant courtroom authority. "You cannot prove we knew it was federally funded. We can just withdraw the claim. We can tear up the agreement right now." "It is way too late for that," I said, offering her a cold, unyielding smile. I pulled the final piece of paper from the manila folder. It was not a civil summons. It was a formal acknowledgement of receipt stamped with the official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's White-Collar Crime Division. I slid the paper perfectly across the table until it rested directly under her shaking hands. I uncovered the fraudulent lien during the due diligence phase of the Vanguard acquisition. I explained, watching the absolute devastation wash over her face. "I did not come here today to negotiate with you. I did not come here to save my company from your petty civil threats. I came here to look you in the eye." I tapped my manicured fingernail directly against the FBI seal. I already handed every single piece of this evidence over to the federal authorities 3 weeks ago, I announced. The investigation is already active. The subpoenas have already been drafted. Your bank records have already been pulled. Gabby let out a sharp, choked gasp, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the sideboard. She grabbed the edge of the wood to keep herself from collapsing onto the floor. Roland buried his face in his hands, letting out a low, guttural groan of absolute defeat. They had thought they were setting a trap for a helpless, desperate daughter. They had no idea they had confidently walked directly into a federal digital guillotine, and I was the one holding the rope. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was the sound of a vacuum sucking the air from the room right before a catastrophic explosion. The sheer weight of the federal seal sitting on the mahogany table acted like a gravitational pull, dragging my family's collective arrogance down into the center of the earth. Roland's face transitioned from a deep, furious crimson to a sickly ashen gray in a matter of seconds. He clutched the edge of the table, his thick knuckles turning bone white as his chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. The imposing patriarch, the man who had dictated the terms of my entire existence and demanded absolute obedience, was suddenly hyperventilating in his custom Italian suit. He looked like a man who had just watched his own obituary flash across a television screen. Connor was the first to physically break the formation. He practically jumped away from the paneled wall, his hands raised instinctively in the air, as if Gabby had suddenly caught fire and he needed to avoid the flames. He stumbled backward, putting as much physical distance between himself and his wife as the private dining room would possibly allow. The calculated, arrogant executive who had just tried to seize control of my company was instantly replaced by a terrified, self-preserving coward. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," Connor stammered, his voice cracking an octave higher than normal. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a pathetic, scrambling desperation. "Kenya, you have to listen to me. I swear to you on my life I did not know about the forged signature. I thought the holding company was a legitimate collateral asset. Gabby told me it was a clean loan authorized by the family. You have to tell the federal agents I was not involved in the original filing. My fingerprints are not on that paperwork." "Connor, shut your damn mouth!" Gabby shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceiling. She pushed herself off the sideboard, her perfectly styled hair falling wildly around her face, the polished veneer of the successful corporate attorney completely shattered. She looked at her husband with absolute venom. "You gladly spent the money. You gladly took the executive bonuses, the luxury vacations, and the lifestyle that federal loan provided to keep us afloat. Do not dare act like an innocent victim now that the bill is finally due." "It is federal bank fraud, Gabby," Connor yelled back, his white savior complex entirely dissolving into sheer, unadulterated panic. "It is a felony. I am a licensed fiduciary managing 9-figure portfolios. I will not go to a federal penitentiary because your father decided to play fast and loose with a government contract to cover up your gross incompetence." The unified front was officially dead. The rats were not just fleeing the sinking ship, they were actively tearing each other apart to secure a spot on the only remaining lifeboat. I sat back in my chair and watched them turn on one another. The fierce family loyalty they had just been preaching about mere seconds ago evaporated the exact moment federal prison was introduced into the equation. It was a beautiful, chaotic symphony of cowardice. Gabby whipped her head back toward me. The arrogant courtroom predator was gone. In her place was a terrified, desperate woman grasping at any possible lifeline to save her own skin and her law license. She slammed her hands down on the table, leaning aggressively across the mahogany, her eyes shining with unshed, panicked tears. "Kenya, you cannot do this," Gabby pleaded, her voice trembling with a frantic, manufactured emotional weight. "You have to call your federal contact right now. You have to retract these documents. Tell them it was a massive misunderstanding. Tell them we had a verbal family agreement and the paperwork was simply mishandled by Dad's attorneys. I will pay you back. We will find the money. You just have to stop the investigation." "You cannot accidentally mismanage a federal signature, Gabby," I replied, my voice calm, clinical, and completely detached from her panic. "You committed blatant identity theft. The FBI does not drop an active investigation into multi-million-dollar wire fraud just because the perpetrators suddenly feel bad about getting caught. Gabby let out a frustrated, choked sob. She reached across the table trying to grab my hand, but I smoothly pulled it away, crossing my arms over my chest and staring at her with cold indifference. "Kenya, listen to me!" Gabby cried, her voice shifting into a frantic pleading register. She was pulling out her ultimate, most manipulative trump card. We are Black women. We are Black women operating in a corporate world that is already designed to tear us apart. You know how hard it is to build a reputation. You know exactly what they do to us when we stumble. We have to stick together. You cannot let the system take down a Black lawyer. They will make an example out of me. They will strip my license and they will parade my face all over the national news. You cannot hand your own sister over to a system built to destroy us. I stared at her. The sheer audacity of her statement actually made my chest tighten, not with sympathy, but with an absolute searing disgust. Do not you dare weaponize our race and sisterhood to excuse your criminality, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register that cut through her hysterics. You did not care about sticking together when you were stealing my identity. You did not care about the system tearing down a Black woman when you forged my name to a federal document, risking my entire future, my company, and my freedom just to fund your fraudulent lifestyle. You weaponized the system against me, Gabby. You used my name as a human shield so you could keep buying imported cars and attending country club galas while treating me like dirt. You are not a victim of the system. You are just a thief who got caught. Gabby recoiled as if I had physically struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to argue to find another angle of manipulation, but no words came out. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing, tears finally spilling over her eyelashes and ruining her expensive makeup. Kenya, please, you have to stop this, Vivian gasped. I shifted my gaze to my mother. Vivian was gripping the back of Roland's chair so tightly, her manicured fingernails were digging into the dark leather. Her chest was rising and falling rapidly. The stoic, aristocratic matriarch who had just ruthlessly ordered me to transfer $40 million was now hyperventilating. Her pearl necklace rattled against her collarbone as she struggled to draw a full breath. "We are your parents!" Vivian cried out, her voice cracking with pure, unfiltered hysteria. "We gave you life. We put a roof over your head. We fed you. You owe us your life, Kenya. You cannot do this to your family out of spite. It is a sin. It is an absolute sin to turn your back on the people who raised you. You will send your own mother to jail. I will not survive in a federal facility. Look at me, I will not survive it." Vivian stumbled awkwardly around the heavy wooden chair rushing toward me. She fell to her knees right beside my seat, clutching the armrest with trembling hands. The woman who had spent my entire life looking down her nose at me, treating my ambitions like embarrassing hobbies, was now physically on the floor, weeping uncontrollably. "Drop the charges," Vivian begged, her voice escalating into a high-pitched wail. "Call your lawyer. Call the agents. Tell them you made a mistake. Tell them you were confused about the corporate structure. We will give you whatever you want. We will sign away our rights to your company. We will never bother you again. Just please, Kenya, I am your mother. You cannot send your mother to a concrete cell." I looked down at the woman weeping on the floor next to me. I waited for the guilt to kick in. I waited for that ingrained childhood instinct to comfort my mother, to override my logic. But I felt absolutely nothing. No guilt, no sorrow, no familial obligation. The well of empathy I had kept reserved for my family had dried up years ago, drained by a lifetime of their conditional love and psychological manipulation. "Get up, Mom," I said, my voice completely flat. "You are embarrassing yourself." "Not until you promise to fix this," Vivian sobbed, refusing to move, gripping my blazer sleeve with a desperate strength. "You have the money. You have the power. You can make this go away." "I am not making anything go away," I said firmly, pulling my arm out of her grasp. "You and Dad did not sit in my cramped apartment and offer me grace when you thought I was a failure. You mocked me, and when you realized I was successful, you tried to extort me. You literally just threatened to tie my company up in probate court for a decade to bleed me dry. You showed me exactly what kind of mercy you possess." I stood up smoothly, forcing Vivian to lean back onto the hardwood floor to avoid being hit by my chair. I gathered my documents from the table, sliding the FBI receipt back into the manila folder, and neatly tied the string closure. Filial piety is earned through love and protection, I stated, looking down at my parents. You protected your image, and you protected Gabby. You used me as collateral damage. The FBI already has the IP addresses used to file the electronic loan documents. They already matched them to Dad's home office network. There is no retracting the claim. There is no claiming a misunderstanding. The federal government does not settle criminal bank fraud in civil mediation. Roland finally looked up from his hands. His eyes were completely hollow, stripped of all their patriarchal authority and bluster. The realization that his money, his country club connections, and his intimidation tactics were entirely useless against the full weight of the federal government had finally broken him. What do we do? Roland whispered, his voice barely audible over Gabby's crying and Vivian's hyperventilating. I picked up my designer bag and slid the folder inside. I looked at the 4 broken people scattering the room like debris after a hurricane. I suggest you do what you told me to do earlier, I replied, walking slowly toward the heavy mahogany doors. I suggest you pack your bags. I wrapped my hand around the cool brass handle of the mahogany door, fully intending to walk out and let the federal authorities handle the wreckage. I had said my piece. The guillotine had fallen, but before I could turn the latch, the explosive sound of heavy crystal shattering against the hardwood floor echoed through the room. I stopped and turned back around. Connor stood near the sideboard, his chest heaving. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. He had hurled his water goblet against the wall, sending shards of glass raining down onto the plush carpet. He was staring at Gabby, but there was no love, no partnership, and certainly no loyalty left in his eyes. There was only the primal, frantic look of a cornered animal realizing it was about to be slaughtered. "I am out!" Connor yelled, his voice cracking with sheer panic. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Gabby's face. "I am completely, entirely out of this." Gabby stared at him, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute confusion. "Connor, what are you doing? We need to focus. We need to figure out how to handle Kenya and her ridiculous threats." "Her threats are not ridiculous, you absolute idiot!" Connor screamed, abandoning every ounce of the polished country club etiquette he usually wore like a second skin. "She just told you the FBI has the IP addresses. They have the wire transfers. This is not a civil dispute over a broken contract. This is federal bank fraud. You forged a signature on a government-backed loan." "We did it for us," Gabby pleaded, taking a desperate step toward him. Her hands reached out, seeking the comfort of her husband, the man who was supposed to be her partner in everything. "We needed the money, Connor. My firm was going under. We would have lost the house. We would have lost the cars. I did what I had to do to protect our lifestyle." Connor actually recoiled physically, snatching his arms away from her grasp as if her touch would infect him with a federal subpoena. "Do not you dare put this on me," Connor snarled. He paced backward, creating as much physical distance between them as the dining room would allow. "You lied to me. You sat in our kitchen 5 years ago and told me your father's trust had secured a clean private capital injection to bridge your firm's operating deficit. You explicitly told me it was clean money. You never said a single word about using your sister's company as a fraudulent guarantor. You never asked where the money came from." Gabby shot back, her confusion rapidly morphing into a vicious defensive rage. The golden child was not used to being attacked, especially not by the man she had bought and paid for. "You happily took the cash. You used the corporate account to pay off your $80,000 country club initiation fee. You used it to buy that ridiculous imported sports car. You lived off the fruits of that loan every single day for 5 years. You do not get to play the innocent victim now just because the bill has finally arrived." "I am a licensed fiduciary," Connor shouted, his voice echoing off the mahogany panels. He pressed his hands against his temples, pulling at his hair in a state of absolute terror. "I manage 9-figure portfolios for elite families. I am vetted by the Securities and Exchange Commission. If the federal government even suspects I am tied to a multi-million-dollar wire fraud scheme, my Series 7 license is permanently revoked. My personal accounts will be frozen. I will be blacklisted from the entire financial sector. I will not spend 10 years in a federal penitentiary because you were too incompetent to run a simple law practice without embezzling your own clients. The sheer brutality of his words struck Gabby like a physical blow. The illusion of her perfect marriage shattered instantly. Connor did not love her. He loved the status she provided, and the moment that status became a liability, he discarded her without a second thought. Roland, who had been sitting in stunned, silent defeat, suddenly stood up. His paternal instincts flared to life, though they were entirely misplaced. "Connor, watch your tone," Roland commanded, attempting to summon his old patriarchal authority. "You are speaking to your wife. We are family. We will handle this discreetly with our attorneys. You do not abandon your family when things get difficult." Connor whipped his head toward my father, his eyes blazing with unrestrained contempt. "You are not my family!" Connor spat, his voice laced with pure venom. "You are a criminal. You enabled her incompetence for decades. You covered up her failures because you cared more about having a daughter with a prestigious job title than you cared about the law. You ruined her, Roland, and you are absolutely not going to ruin me." Vivian gasped from her spot on the floor, covering her mouth with her hands. "Connor, please lower your voice. The staff will hear you." "I do not care who hears me," Connor roared. He turned his attention back to Gabby, delivering the final devastating blow. "I am filing for divorce tomorrow morning. I am calling my attorney the second I walk out of these doors. I want my name entirely severed from yours. I want a formal legal separation of all our assets before the FBI issues the first freeze order. We are done, Gabby. It is completely over." Gabby let out a sharp, guttural scream of absolute fury. She lunged forward, grabbing the heavy silver serving tray from the center of the table and hurling it directly at Connor. It crashed against the wall inches from his head, leaving a deep dent in the expensive wood paneling. "You coward!" Gabby shrieked, her voice tearing at the seams. "You weak, pathetic coward! You are nothing without this family. You only made senior vice president because my father called in favors with your board of directors. You are a fraud, Connor. You are just as fake as I am." Connor ignored her entirely. He adjusted his blazer, taking a deep, shuddering breath to compose himself. He completely turned his back on his weeping mother-in-law, his furious father-in-law, and his hysterical wife. He walked straight toward me. The arrogant, condescending executive who had tried to mock my clothing and offer me a receptionist job just an hour ago was entirely gone. He stopped 3 feet in front of me, his posture submissive, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. "Kenya, please," Connor begged, his voice dropping to a desperate, urgent whisper. "You heard me. I am divorcing her. I am cutting all ties with this family. I had absolutely no knowledge of the forgery. You have to believe me." I stood silently, my hand still resting on the brass door handle, watching him beg. "You are the sole owner of Vanguard Financial now," Connor continued, swallowing hard, his eyes pleading for mercy. "You are my boss. I can be an asset to you. I know where all of Roland's hidden offshore accounts are located. I know exactly how he structured the transfer of the stolen funds. I will give you everything you need to completely dismantle him in civil court. Just please, when you speak to the federal agents, you have to tell them I was completely ignorant. Keep my name off the federal indictment. Please, Kenya, save my career." I looked at the desperate man standing in front of me, willing to sell out his wife and his father-in-law in a heartbeat just to save his own skin. I let the silence stretch out, allowing him to marinate in his own pathetic cowardice. "You really think a divorce filing tomorrow morning is going to protect you from a federal audit, Connor?" I said smoothly, my voice barely above a whisper. "Barely." Connor's desperate smile faltered. "What do you mean?" "I did not sign the guarantor agreement. I am legally clear." I tilted my head, offering him a smile that was entirely devoid of warmth. "You are legally clear on the initial loan origination. But you manage the family finances, do you not? When I initiated the due diligence protocol for the Vanguard financial acquisition last week, my forensic accountants gained full access to your firm's internal ledgers." I took a slow step toward him, watching the color drain completely from his face. "They found the routing numbers, Connor," I stated coldly. "They found the exact transactions where you deliberately diverted the fraudulent federal loan money out of Gabby's failing law practice and directly into your own private Vanguard investment portfolios. You did not just spend the stolen money, you actively laundered it through your own firm. Connor's confession about laundering the stolen funds through his own firm hung in the air like a live grenade. The silence in the private dining room was absolute, save for the ragged, uneven breathing of my parents and my sister. Gabby stared at her husband with an expression of pure, unfiltered hatred. Her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might shatter right there in her mouth. Her own husband had not only participated in the felony that was about to ruin her life, but he was actively trying to cut a deal with me to save himself while throwing her to the federal wolves. But before Gabby could launch another physical attack across the room, Roland slammed his heavy fist against the mahogany table. The crystal glasses rattled violently. Roland completely ignored Connor's treachery. The imposing patriarch did not care that his son-in-law was a coward. His brain had instantly switched into pure transactional survival mode. He turned his massive frame toward me, his face sweating profusely, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. He realized the terrifying severity of the situation, but his arrogance still convinced him that money could solve any problem he created. "Pay it," Roland ordered. His voice shook, completely stripped of its usual commanding resonance, replaced by a frantic, breathless desperation. "You have the money, Kenya. You have $85 million in liquid and corporate assets. Just pay the damn loan." I stared at him, my expression entirely blank, letting the sheer audacity of his demand echo off the walls. "It is $2 million. Roland continued, pacing frantically behind his chair like a caged animal. "That is absolute pocket change to you now. You transfer the $2 million to the federal underwriters first thing tomorrow morning. You clear the balance in full. If the bank is made whole, the FBI loses their primary financial incentive to pursue the wire fraud charges. We can say the paperwork was an internal clerical error that has been fully rectified by the parent company." Vivian nodded enthusiastically, her tear-streaked face lighting up with a sudden desperate hope. She grabbed the edge of the table and pulled herself up from the floor. "Yes, exactly," Vivian cried out, wiping her ruined mascara. "We will pay you back, Kenya. We will set up a payment plan. Just wire the funds tomorrow. Call it the family tax. Every successful person has to pay a family tax. This is yours. You pay this, and we can all move on." The absolute delusion in their eyes was staggering. They had stolen my identity, jeopardized my freedom, and insulted my entire existence for decades. Now, backed into a corner by the federal government, they actually believed they could command me to empty my bank accounts to cover up their crimes and call it a family tax. "You want me to pay $2 million to cover up your federal crimes?" I stated, my voice dangerously soft, slicing through their frantic rationalizations. Gabby slammed her hands on the table, her desperation making her reckless. "You owe us, Kenya. If we had not used your company for that loan, you would never have had the capital to scale it. We gave you the foundation for your success. You have the money. Just pay the $2 million and make this go away. Call it the family tax." I looked at my sister, shaking my head with a slow, chilling finality. The FBI does not drop a multi-million-dollar federal bank fraud case just because the thief's rich sister suddenly pays the balance, I explained, keeping my tone perfectly clinical. You committed identity theft. Connor laundered the money across state lines. You defrauded a government entity. The crime is already logged in the federal database. A wire transfer tomorrow morning does not erase a felony. It just makes me an accessory after the fact. Roland stepped forward, his face turning a deep, furious crimson. "You have a team of elite corporate lawyers. You own a massive holding company. Make them fix it. Tell them to bury the paperwork." I reached back into my designer bag. I did not pull out a checkbook. I pulled out a second, significantly thinner manila envelope. I placed it gently on the polished wood of the table. "I cannot erase a federal indictment," I announced, tapping the fresh envelope with my manicured fingernail. "But I can direct my legal team to cooperate with the prosecution in a way that mitigates your sentencing. I can ensure that Vivian gets house arrest instead of a federal penitentiary. I can ensure Roland serves his time in a minimum security facility instead of a maximum security block. I can ensure Gabby avoids the harshest possible sentencing for her embezzlement." They stopped breathing. They stared at the thin envelope as if it contained a venomous snake. But my cooperation comes with an absolute non-negotiable price. I stated, my voice ringing with unwavering authority. I slid the documents out of the envelope and spread them across the table. They were legally binding transfer deeds, printed on heavy bond paper requiring only their signatures and a notary stamp to become instantly active. You are going to sign over every single remaining asset you possess, I commanded, looking directly into Roland's terrified eyes. Gabby, you are signing over your entire equity share in your failing law firm. Roland and Vivian, you are signing the deed to the suburban house in Fairfield. You are signing over the keys to the leased Porsche in the parking lot. You are giving up every single piece of collateral you have left to your name. Vivian gasped, clutching her pearl necklace as if she were having a heart attack. You are making us homeless. You are taking everything we own. I am making you accountable. I corrected her instantly, my tone completely devoid of mercy. And I am not keeping a single cent of it. Every asset you sign over tonight is going directly into Big Mama's Community Trust, the exact same trust I solely control. Big Mama left you that seed money, but you were wasting it staring at computer screens. We put it into Gabby's real career. That's what family does. We protect our investments. That was your justification for stealing from me. Well, I am protecting my investments now. You are going to fund her legacy with the last remaining scraps of your fraudulent lives. Roland's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The sheer humiliation of being stripped of his wealth and his power by the daughter he had always considered a failure finally broke his composure. He scoffed, a loud, ugly sound that reverberated through the quiet room. He stood up straight, puffing out his chest in a pathetic display of lost dominance. You are bluffing, Roland growled, pointing a thick, trembling finger directly at my face. You are trying to scare us out of our property because you are a bitter, vindictive girl playing a game of chicken. The FBI does not move this fast. They do not send federal agents to a country club on a Sunday evening. You have no power here. He turned to Vivian and Gabby, violently motioning toward the door. Do not sign a single thing. We are leaving right now. We will call our own attorneys in the morning, and we will crush her in civil court. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to match his screaming. I did not try to convince him of the danger he was in. I simply lifted my left arm and pulled back the silk sleeve of my blazer, exposing my watch. I stared at the illuminated dial, watching the seconds tick away with absolute chilling precision. I looked up at Roland, meeting his furious gaze with eyes as cold as deep winter. You have exactly 60 seconds before the squad cars pull up the driveway. 50 seconds. The silence in the private dining room was no longer just heavy, it was suffocating. Roland stood frozen, his finger still pointing at me, but the fire in his eyes had completely extinguished. He was waiting for me to blink. He was waiting for the obedient, desperate daughter he had bullied for decades to lower her gaze and apologize. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on his, my wrist raised, watching the second hand of my Cartier watch sweep ruthlessly across the dial. 40 seconds. The faint, unmistakable sound of sirens bled through the thick, soundproofed glass of the country club windows. It was a distant, high-pitched wail, but in the dead quiet of the exclusive gated community, it sounded like a death knell. Vivian let out a sharp, ragged gasp, her hands flying to her face. She rushed toward the window, pulling back the heavy velvet curtain. 30 seconds. The wailing grew exponentially louder, echoing off the manicured golf course and the multi-million-dollar estates surrounding the clubhouse. Then the visual reality struck. Flashing red and blue lights bounced aggressively against the dark glass, casting frantic, chaotic shadows across the mahogany-paneled walls and the shattered crystal on the floor. The federal authorities were not bluffing, and neither was I. Roland's knees finally gave out. The imposing patriarch, the man who had built his entire identity on dominating everyone in his orbit, collapsed heavily into his chair. The color drained from his face entirely, leaving behind a sickly, terrified gray. He stared at the flashing lights painting the walls of his favorite dining room, the very place where he had intended to celebrate stealing my company. 20 seconds. They are here! Vivian screamed, her voice tearing with pure, unfiltered panic. She spun around, abandoning the window and lunging toward the table. Roland, they are actually here. You have to sign it. Sign the papers right now. I cannot sign away the house, Vivian. Roland choked out, his hands trembling violently as he stared at the transfer deeds resting on the table. If I sign this, we have absolutely nothing. The trust gets everything. We will be bankrupt. We will be homeless. If you do not sign it, we will be in federal prison, Vivian shrieked, grabbing a solid gold Mont Blanc pen from Roland's breast pocket and slamming it onto the table in front of him. I am not spending the rest of my life in a concrete cell because you are too proud to admit you lost. Sign the damn paper, Roland. 15 seconds. Gabby did not wait for her father. She shoved Connor out of the way, scrambling toward the table like a starving animal fighting for a scrap of meat. She snatched a different pen from her designer purse, her hands shaking so violently she could barely remove the cap. Where do I sign? Gabby begged, her eyes wide and bloodshot, scanning the legal documents. Kenya, please just show me where to sign. I am giving you the firm. I am giving you the equity. Just tell them I cooperated. Tell them I gave it all back. Bottom of page 4, initial page 5, full signature on page 6. I instructed, my voice calm and entirely devoid of pity. Gabby aggressively scrawled her name across the heavy bond paper, her tears splashing onto the ink and smudging her signature. The arrogant, cutthroat senior partner was completely gone, replaced by a terrified thief desperately trying to buy her way out of a federal cage. 10 seconds. Kenya, what about me? Connor practically shouted, his face slick with cold sweat. He pushed his way to the table, staring at the asset transfer documents. I do not own the Fairfield house. The firm is not in my name. What do you want from me? I will give you whatever you want. Your offshore investment portfolios, the leased Porsche Carrera in the valet lot, and the remaining balance of your liquid savings accounts. I listed, sliding his specific transfer agreement across the polished wood. You launder stolen money, you forfeit the profits. Sign the line, Connor, or I let the FBI forensic team seize it all manually. Connor did not hesitate. He grabbed Gabby's pen the second she dropped it and began furiously signing his name, relinquishing every single asset he had accumulated through years of fraud and deception. The luxury cars, the hidden accounts, the status symbols he had used to mock my perfectly honest living. It was all gone in a matter of seconds. 5 seconds. The sirens abruptly cut off, replaced by the aggressive crunch of heavy tires skidding onto the gravel driveway of the clubhouse. The flashing red and blue lights were blindingly bright now, illuminating the room in a rhythmic, violent pulse. Vivian physically grabbed Roland by his collar, shaking him with a frantic, terrifying strength. Sign it, Roland. They are walking up the steps. Sign the paper. Roland let out a low, defeated groan. He picked up the gold pen. His hand hovered over the signature line for the Fairfield estate, the crown jewel of his manufactured legacy. The house where I had grown up, being told I was a failure. The house where they had hosted galas funded by my stolen identity. With a shaking, devastated hand, Roland pressed the pen to the paper and signed his name. Time was up. I stepped forward smoothly, gathering the signed documents from the table. I checked each signature, ensuring every initial was in place and every line was executed perfectly. They had signed away their law firm, their mansion, their luxury vehicles, and their hidden cash. They had legally transferred their entire fraudulent empire into Big Mama's community trust. I tapped the heavy stack of papers against the mahogany table to align the edges, then slid them securely into my bag. Heavy, authoritative footsteps echoed loudly in the marble hallway outside the private dining room, the sound of multiple men approaching with absolute purpose. Gabby fell back against the wall, sliding down, until she was sitting on the floor amid the shattered crystal of Connor's broken glass. She pulled her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth, her perfectly styled hair plastered to her wet face. Vivian stood frozen behind Roland's chair, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with terror as she stared at the heavy wooden doors. Connor simply stood perfectly still, his head bowed, looking at his empty hands. What happens now? Roland whispered, staring blankly at the empty space on the table where his wealth had been just moments before. Now, the federal agents walk through those doors and place you all under arrest for conspiracy wire fraud and identity theft, I stated calmly, adjusting the lapels of my blazer. They will seize your electronics, they will confiscate your passports, and they will place you in federal holding. Vivian let out a muffled scream. But we signed the papers. You said you would stop them. I never said I would stop them, Vivian. I said I could not erase a federal indictment. I corrected her, my tone completely merciless. I said I would direct my legal team to cooperate with the prosecution to mitigate your sentencing, and I will keep my word. Because you signed over your assets, my attorneys will inform the federal prosecutor that the victims have been fully compensated. We will recommend minimum security facilities and reduced sentences. You just bought yourselves 3 to 5 years instead of 20. You should be thanking me. Heavy fists pounded aggressively against the mahogany doors. The sound reverberated through the room like thunder. Federal Bureau of Investigation, a deep, booming voice shouted from the hallway. Open the door! I looked at the four of them, taking in the absolute devastation on their faces. The united front of extortion was gone. The arrogant mockery was gone. They were no longer the powerful, untouchable family that had discarded me. They were just criminals waiting to be processed. I walked toward the entrance, pausing for a single second to look back at my father. You were right about one thing, Dad, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the room. Failures absolutely do not belong in this family. I reached out, grasped the brass handles, and pulled the doors open, stepping aside to let the agents do their job. The silence in the private dining room shattered the moment the red and blue lights began violently strobing through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The distant, high-pitched wail of sirens rapidly amplified, tearing through the quiet exclusivity of the gated country club, growing louder and more aggressive, until the vehicles aggressively crunched onto the gravel driveway just outside. The 60 seconds were up. Panic, absolute and unfiltered, finally exploded inside the room. Vivian let out a piercing, guttural shriek, abandoning her proud, aristocratic posture entirely as she scrambled away from the windows. Roland's chest heaved, his face drained of all its furious color, leaving behind a sickly, terrified gray. He looked at the heavy mahogany doors as if staring down the barrel of a loaded weapon. Connor dropped to his knees, his hands clasped together, completely abandoning his wife as he looked up at me. Kenya, please, I beg you. Tell them I cooperated. Tell them I was going to give it all back. I will sign anything you want. Do not let them take me. Gabby simply froze. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and fixed on the flashing lights bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. She had finally realized that I was not the family scapegoat she could bully into submission. I was the executioner, and the blade was already dropping. The heavy doors swung completely open, forcefully pushed aside by 3 men and 2 women, wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI. The lead agent, a tall, no-nonsense man with a hardened gaze, stepped into the dining room. His eyes swept over the shattered glass, the dented wood paneling, and the 4 terrified people scrambling in the center of the carpet. "Nobody move," the lead agent commanded, his voice projecting with absolute practiced authority. "Federal agents, keep your hands exactly where I can see them." The room descended into a flurry of chaotic, humiliating action. Vivian wept hysterically as a female agent instructed her to turn and place her hands flat against the wall. Roland moved like a mechanical shell, his eyes dead and vacant, as the cold steel handcuffs clicked securely around his thick wrists. Connor attempted to initiate a desperate, rambling negotiation about his fiduciary licenses, only to be sternly ordered to remain silent. Gabby was the last to be processed. Her designer dress was twisted, her perfectly styled hair was ruined, and her face was a mask of profound, devastating shock. She glared at me as the agent secured her wrists behind her back, her breathing ragged. "Agent Miller," I said smoothly, stepping toward the center of the room, my voice easily cutting through the chaos. "Before you escort them out for transport, I have one final piece of personal correspondence to return to my sister. It will only take a moment." The lead agent nodded once, signaling his team to hold their positions. I walked slowly toward Gabby. The air between us was electric thick with the complete reversal of our lifelong power dynamic. For 31 years, she had looked down on me. She had mocked my clothes, my ambitions, and my intellect. Just 2 hours ago, she had confidently strutted into this room, fully believing she held my entire future in her manicured hands. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the crumpled, brightly colored piece of paper she had shoved into my chest at the very beginning of the night. It was the flyer for the $20 an hour receptionist job at the local dental clinic. The ultimate insult. The visual representation of exactly what she thought I was worth. I smoothed the wrinkled paper out on the mahogany table right in front of her. I pulled a sleek silver fountain pen from my bag and clicked it open. You were very concerned about my financial stability earlier this evening. Gabby, I said, my voice projecting clearly through the room so every single person, including my parents, could hear. You were worried I would not be able to afford my rent. You graciously offered me a lifeline because you believed I was an absolute failure. Let me update your records. I flipped the cheap flyer over to the blank white side. With deliberate sweeping strokes, I wrote a single number across the paper. I capped the pen and slammed the flyer back onto the table directly alongside my certified bank statements and the finalized legally binding acquisition paperwork for Vanguard Financial. Gabby's eyes dropped to the table. Roland, Vivian, and Connor strained their necks to look. The number written in bold black ink was $80,450,000. Liquid, I clarified, watching the absolute devastation ripple across her tear-streaked face. That is not tied up in speculative stocks, Gabby. That is not a projected corporate valuation. That is cash sitting securely in a federally insured high-yield trust account that you can never touch. But that is just the liquid capital. Let me break down exactly what that money means for your current reality. I tapped the thick stack of financial documents. I wanted this dismantling to be mathematically precise. I wanted them to understand exactly how completely I had outplayed them while they thought I was hiding in the shadows. The portfolio breakdown. Asset 1. The Belmont Country Club. I looked around the opulent wood-paneled room, gesturing to the crystal chandeliers and the vaulted ceiling. You love this club, Roland. You have spent decades holding court in this exact dining room, pretending you were local royalty. What you did not know is that the club's board of directors has been quietly drowning in operational debt for the last 3 years. Last month, my holding company aggressively acquired a majority stake in this entire property. I am not just a member here. I am the primary owner. You are currently standing in my building, trespassing on my property, drinking my water. Roland's jaw actually dropped. He looked around the room as if the mahogany walls were suddenly closing in to crush him. Asset 2, the Fairfield estate. I turned my attention to my weeping mother. Vivian, you were very concerned about becoming homeless if Roland signed those transfer papers. Let me clarify your housing situation. Your husband leveraged your suburban mansion to the absolute breaking point to fund his failing investments. His creditors were terrified. They were desperate to offload that toxic debt. 2 weeks ago, my financial team purchased the primary deed of trust to your home for pennies on the dollar. You do not own that house anymore, Mom. I am your sole mortgage holder, and you are currently in severe default. I will be initiating the eviction protocols the moment you are booked at the federal precinct. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless wheeze, slumping heavily against the agent holding her arms. Her entire identity was tied to that house, to the prestigious address, to the perfectly manicured lawn she used to lord over her neighbors. It was all instantly gone. Asset 3, the fake life. Finally, I locked eyes with Gabby. And then there is you, your pristine, flawless, incredibly expensive life. You thought you were so clever hiding your embezzlement through Connor's firm. But when Vanguard Financial folded under federal scrutiny, their toxic assets were packaged and sold at auction. I bought that package, Gabby. I own the debt on your firm. I own the lease agreement on your imported Porsche. I hold the paperwork for your luxury condo. I own the mortgage to your entire fraudulent existence. I leaned in close, ensuring every single word etched itself permanently into her memory. You called me a failure, I whispered, my voice dripping with cold, calculated finality. You told me I did not belong in this family. You were absolutely right. I do not belong with thieves, extortionists, and cowards. You played a civil game of checkers, Gabby. I played a federal game of chess, and I bought the entire board before you even realized the match had started. Gabby squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing openly now, her shoulders shaking violently as the absolute totality of her ruin finally crushed her. There were no more legal loopholes. There were no more wealthy family favors to call in. I had systematically dismantled their financial, social, and personal lives with mathematical precision. Take them out, I instructed the lead agent, stepping back and turning away from them. The agents moved swiftly, marching my parents, my sister, and my brother-in-law out of the private dining room. The heavy brass cuffs clinked together in a shameful rhythm. Their expensive leather shoes dragged across the carpet. They were walked out through the main lobby of the country club, past the horrified stares of the elite members they had spent their entire lives trying to impress, and shoved into the back of waiting federal vehicles. I stood alone in the quiet dining room. I picked up my certified documents, leaving the crumpled $20 an hour flyer sitting alone on the mahogany table as a permanent monument to their arrogance. I walked out into the cool evening air, completely free. The flashing lights from outside continued to paint the walls in harsh, unforgiving strokes of crimson and blue. Agent Miller and his federal team held their positions, their grips firm on the arms of my completely shattered family. The air in the room was thick, suffocating under the weight of their immediate total ruin. They were waiting for me to step aside so they could be marched out into the humiliating glare of the public eye. But I was not finished. For 31 years I had swallowed my pride. I had absorbed their subtle jabs, their outright insults, and their endless calculated attempts to make me feel small. They had operated on the absolute belief that wealth insulated them from consequences, and that my lack of traditional, flashy success made me a permissible target for their cruelty. I was going to correct that misconception down to the very last decimal point. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice or let a single ounce of anger seep into my tone. I simply walked slowly down the line of my handcuffed family, delivering the final blow with cold mathematical precision. You spent my entire life attaching a price tag to my worth, I began, my heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor, stopping first in front of my mother. Vivian was trembling violently, her eyes darting between me and the federal agents, completely incapable of processing her new reality. Do you remember my college graduation, Vivian? I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level. You refused to attend the ceremony because you were embarrassed that I chose a state school over an Ivy League institution. You told your friends I was settling for mediocrity. You told me my education was a poor investment that would yield zero returns. That single arrogant miscalculation just cost you the deed to your $3 million Fairfield estate. You traded your home for your pride. Vivian let out a strangled, breathless sob, her chin dropping to her chest as the reality of her impending homelessness crashed down upon her. I took a slow, deliberate step to my right, stopping in front of my sister. Gabby was no longer crying. She was staring at the floor with a vacant, hollow expression, her mind completely shattered by the destruction of her pristine, fake life. When I started K-Edutech in my tiny, unheated apartment, I came to you for legal advice, I said, forcing her to lift her head and look at me. I asked you to review a standard vendor contract. You laughed in my face. You told me my little hobby company would never generate enough capital to buy a decent lunch, let alone pay your hourly retainer. You stole my corporate identity because you genuinely believed my business was completely worthless, and I was too stupid to notice. That stolen lunch just cost you your $2 million equity share in your law firm, your luxury condo, and your law license. You are bankrupt because you underestimated the sister you love to humiliate. Gabby squeezed her eyes shut, turning her face away from me as fresh tears tracked through her ruined makeup. I moved down the line, stopping squarely in front of Connor. He was sweating profusely, his expensive suit clinging to his damp shoulders. The slick, confident financial executive was completely gone. Connor. I stated, watching him flinch at the sound of his own name. Just 2 hours ago, you looked me up and down, judged my outfit, and handed me a flyer for a $20 an hour receptionist job at a local dental clinic. You told me I was unqualified to sit in the same room as you. Your sheer, unadulterated arrogance just cost you your 9-figure investment portfolios, your offshore accounts, and your entire career in the financial sector. You laundered federal money because you thought you were untouchable. You are not untouchable. You are just unemployed and indicted. Connor opened his mouth to speak, to offer another pathetic, groveling plea, but Agent Miller gave his arm a sharp tug, forcing him into absolute silence. Finally, I turned to the center of the room. I stopped in front of Roland. The imposing patriarch, the man who had demanded absolute obedience and measured a person's entire value by their bank account, looked like a hollow, deflated shell of a human being. "And you," I whispered, stepping close enough that he was forced to look me directly in the eyes. "You sat in that chair and called me a failure. You told me I lacked the predatory instinct required to build a legacy. You told me to pay $2 million and call it a family tax. You demanded my submission because you thought you held all the cards." I leaned in, ensuring my words were carved permanently into his ego. "You have never once known my actual value, Roland," I said smoothly. "You traded your freedom, your legacy, and your entire empire for a fraudulent loan because you were too incompetent to sustain your own wealth. Your arrogance did not just cost you your reputation. It cost you exactly $80,450,000. I am not the family failure. I am your executioner." Roland's jaw trembled. He opened his mouth desperately, searching for a rebuttal, a final insult, any scrap of power he could cling to. But there was nothing left. He had been completely, utterly dismantled. Right at that moment, the heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open entirely. The federal agents had secured the perimeter, but now a line of uniformed local police officers stepped into the room to assist with the physical transport. The local officers were men and women who regularly patrolled the affluent neighborhoods of Fairfield. These were people who recognized Roland. They were people who knew the family name. They had guarded their galas and directed traffic for their country club events. The ultimate crushing humiliation had arrived. The local community was about to witness their absolute downfall. Vivian saw the uniforms and completely snapped. The ingrained, desperate need to maintain appearances and protect the family image instantly overrode her logic. She could not let the local authorities see them as criminals. She lunged forward, fighting against the federal agent's grip, thrusting her handcuffed wrists out as she threw herself toward me. "Kenya, darling!" Vivian cried out, her voice pitching into a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured tone. She was trying to wrap her arms around me desperately, trying to project the image of a loving, united family for the police officers watching from the doorway. "Tell them it is a misunderstanding. Tell them we are a good family. We love each other, Kenya. Tell them we are just having a private family dinner." I did not flinch. I simply took one smooth, deliberate step backward. Vivian grasped at empty air, stumbling awkwardly before the FBI agent firmly pulled her back into line. She looked absolutely pathetic, a woman who cared more about country club optics than the fact that she was currently wearing federal steel. I smoothed the lapels of my blazer and looked away from her, turning my attention to the doorway. The lead detective of the local squad stepped forward, his eyes sweeping over the shattered glass, the weeping women and the broken men. He stopped, his posture rigid and professional, his gaze landing squarely on the former patriarch and his golden child. "Are these the individuals who submitted the fraudulent federal loan applications?" "Yes, detective." I stated, my voice slicing through the heavy, stagnant air of the dining room. "Those are the individuals. The evidence of their wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering has already been handed over to the federal prosecutor by my legal team." The lead detective did not hesitate. He gave a short, sharp nod to the uniformed officers and federal agents standing behind him. They moved into the room with practiced, terrifying efficiency. The absolute reality of the situation finally breached the thick walls of delusion my family had built around themselves. The harsh metallic clink of handcuffs being unpouched echoed loudly, a sound so entirely foreign to the polished mahogany walls of the Belmont Country Club that it seemed to freeze time itself. An agent grabbed Roland by the shoulder, spinning him around and slamming his chest against the expensive silk wallpaper. Roland let out a strangled gasp of indignation. The imposing patriarch, a man who had spent his entire life commanding rooms and demanding absolute submission, instinctively tried to yank his arm away. It was the reflex of a massive ego that had never faced a physical consequence. The agent did not indulge him. With a swift, forceful motion, the agent pinned Roland's arm behind his back, driving a knee into the back of Roland's leg to force his stance wide. The cold steel cuffs snapped shut around Roland's thick wrists with a definitive, inescapable click. Roland Wilson, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. The agent stated, his voice a flat, bureaucratic monotone that completely ignored Roland's status. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. To my right, Gabby completely lost whatever fragile grip she still had on her sanity. As a female officer approached her with an open pair of cuffs, Gabby scrambled backward, her expensive heels slipping on the scattered crystal from Connor's broken glass. She hit the edge of the dining table and shrank away, throwing her hands up in front of her face. "Do not touch me!" Gabby screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. "I am a senior partner at a corporate law firm. You cannot put those on me. I know the district attorney. I know the regional judges. You have no idea who you are dealing with." The female officer was entirely unmoved. She grasped Gabby by the wrists, pulling her hands down with a firm, unyielding grip. Gabby thrashed, kicking her legs and sobbing wildly, her perfectly tailored designer dress twisting awkwardly around her waist. The officer spun her around and secured her wrists tightly against the small of her back. The click of Gabby's handcuffs sounded identical to Roland's. "Brianna Wilson," the officer recited smoothly over Gabby's frantic, hyperventilating sobs. "You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you." The heavy, soundproof doors to the private dining room had been left wide open by the police. The commotion had drawn an audience. The country club's general manager, Arthur, stood in the hallway, his face entirely pale. Behind him, a cluster of waitstaff busboys and a few high-paying club members had gathered, peering into the room with unabashed horror and morbid fascination. Roland turned his head, his cheek pressed painfully against the wallpaper, and made direct eye contact with Arthur. For decades, Roland had tipped Arthur hundreds of dollars just to secure his favorite table. He had treated the staff like his personal servants, flexing his wealth to buy their absolute deference. "Arthur." Roland choked out, his face flushing a deep, humiliated purple. "Clear the hallway. Tell them to stop looking at me. Clear the hallway right now." Arthur did not move to help. He did not bark orders at his staff to protect Roland's privacy. Instead, Arthur slowly took a step backward, physically distancing himself from the disgraced patriarch. He looked from Roland to the federal agents, and then directly to me, the new majority owner of the very building he managed. The entire social hierarchy Roland had bled himself dry to maintain was completely eradicated in front of an audience of his peers. While the agents finished reading my father and sister their rights, I noticed a slight movement near the service entrance at the back of the room. Connor was slowly edging along the wall, keeping his back pressed against the wood paneling, desperately trying to blend into the shadows. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes darting frantically toward the heavy swinging doors that led to the kitchen. He waited until the lead detective turned his back, then leaned over to a younger uniform standing near the perimeter. "Listen, officer," Connor whispered, his voice trembling with a pathetic, rat-like urgency. "I am just a bystander here. I had absolutely no idea what my wife was doing. She handles all her own finances. I am a victim of her deception just as much as anyone else. I need to leave before the press gets wind of this. My firm will completely panic." He took a step toward the service door, fully intending to throw Gabby to the federal wolves and slip out the back to save his own skin. Just as Connor reached for the brass push plate of the service door, it swung violently open from the other side, forcing him to stumble backward. Standing in the doorway was Malik, my chief financial officer. Malik was impeccably dressed in a charcoal Tom Ford suit, his posture perfectly rigid, holding a single crisp manila folder in his left hand. He looked at Connor with an expression of absolute professional disgust. "You are not going anywhere, Connor," Malik said, his deep voice easily cutting through the sound of Gabby's sobbing and the crackle of police radios. Connor blinked, trying to puff out his chest and salvage a shred of his corporate authority. "Who the hell are you? Get out of my way. I am an executive partner at Vanguard Financial, and I have nothing to do with this domestic dispute." Malik stepped fully into the room, letting the service door swing shut behind him. He walked directly up to Connor, stopping mere inches from his face. "You were an executive partner at Vanguard Financial," Malik corrected smoothly. "As Kenya mentioned earlier, our holding company officially finalized the acquisition of Vanguard's distressed debt assets late last night. That means, as of this morning, Vanguard operates as a wholly owned subsidiary of our corporate portfolio, which makes me your direct employer." Connor's face went entirely blank. His eyes darted to me, then back to Malik, the reality of his trapped situation finally sinking in. He was not just losing his stolen money. He was cornered by the very people he had tried to rob. Malik unclasped the manila folder and pulled out a single sheet of heavy watermarked paper. He held it out, pressing it firmly against Connor's chest. "This is your official notice of termination, effective immediately," Malik stated, his voice ringing with absolute clinical detachment. "You are being fired for cause. Our internal audits, which we provided to the FBI, confirm your direct complicity in laundering fraudulent loans through Vanguard's offshore accounts. This is a direct violation of the firm's strict ethics and compliance clauses." Connor stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold it. "You cannot do this. I have a contract. I have millions in unvested stock options. I have a golden parachute clause. I will sue you for every dime you have." "Your contract is voided upon the commission of a federal felony," Malik replied without missing a single beat. "Your stock options are canceled. Your severance package is permanently revoked. You will not receive another cent from Vanguard, and because your termination for fraud will be filed publicly with the Securities and Exchange Commission tomorrow morning, you will never work in the financial sector again." Connor crumpled. The arrogant, slick executive who had mocked me for working honestly was completely stripped to the bone. He dropped the termination letter onto the floor, his knees giving out slightly as he leaned against the wall for support. He had tried to walk out the back door claiming to be a victim, but Malik had ensured he left with absolutely nothing. No job, no money, no reputation, and no future. "Officers," the lead FBI agent called out, gesturing toward the door. "Move the suspects to the transport vehicles. We are done here." The officers grabbed Roland and Gabby by their arms, hauling them forward. Roland kept his head down, his chin tucked tightly to his chest, as he was marched past the gawking country club staff. He could not bear to look at the people who had once feared him. Gabby, however, was a completely different story. She dragged her feet, sobbing and pleading wildly, looking back over her shoulder at her husband. "Connor!" Gabby screamed, her voice tearing through the elegant hallway. "Tell them to stop. Call our lawyers. Do not let them take me." Connor did not look at her. He kept his eyes glued to the floor, staring at his termination letter, completely abandoning the woman he had conspired with. The officers pulled Gabby through the main lobby, her shrieks echoing off the marble floors, until the heavy glass doors of the country club closed behind her, cutting off her voice entirely. The room fell into a heavy, ringing silence. The flashing lights from the driveway faded as the federal vehicles pulled away, leaving the private dining room dimly lit by the crystal fixtures overhead. Only Vivian remained. She stood alone near the head of the table, her expensive pearls resting against her chest, her designer gown feeling entirely out of place in the wreckage of her life. She looked at the empty space where her husband and daughter had been standing. She looked at Connor, who was slowly, silently making his way out the service door, running away like a coward into the dark. Finally, she turned and looked at me. Her knees buckled. Vivian crashed to the floor, the sound of her impact muted by the thick imported carpet. She crawled forward, the broken glass biting into the fabric of her dress, until she was mere feet away from me. She looked up, her face a ruined, desperate mess of smeared makeup and uncontrollable tears. Kenya! Vivian gasped, reaching her trembling hands out toward my ankles. Kenya, please. You have to pay their bail. You have to fix this. You have all that money. You have $80 million. You can afford the best defense attorneys in the country. You can get them out of that horrible place tonight. I looked down at the woman who had birthed me, a woman who had spent 3 decades treating me as an unfortunate stain on her perfect social tapestry. She was not crying because her family had committed horrific crimes. She was crying because the illusion of her perfection had been shattered. You have to do it for Big Mama! Vivian sobbed, her voice taking on a sickeningly manipulative, pleading tone. She tried to weaponize the only pure memory I had left. Big Mama loved this family. She would want us to stick together. She gave you that inheritance so you could protect us. She would be heartbroken to see Roland and Gabby in handcuffs. Please, Kenya, do it for her memory. I felt a cold, absolute calm wash over me. The anger that had fueled me for years simply evaporated, leaving behind a sharp, focused clarity. I crouched down, bending my knees slowly until I was exactly at her eye level. I did not reach out to comfort her. I kept my hands resting calmly on my knees, forcing her to look directly into my face. Do not ever speak her name again, I whispered, my voice so cold it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. Big Mama did not leave me that money to protect you. Big Mama left me that money because she knew exactly what you were. She knew you would drain every single cent of it trying to look rich for country club managers and neighbors who do not actually care if you live or die. Vivian recoiled, her breath catching in her throat as she stared into my eyes. She saw absolutely no mercy. You spent my entire life making your choices. I continued, measuring every word with lethal precision. You watched Roland belittle me. You watched Gabby steal from me. You smiled, you poured your wine, and you chose your golden child every single time. I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my blazer. I looked down at her one final time, observing the pathetic, ruined matriarch kneeling in the wreckage of her own arrogance. You chose her, Vivian, I said, turning away from her and walking toward the grand wooden doors. Now you can figure out how to share her cell. I did not look back. I walked out of the private dining room, leaving Vivian completely alone, sobbing uncontrollably on the floor of a rented room she could no longer afford. I walked through the grand lobby of the country club, the staff parting silently to let me pass, their eyes filled with a new, absolute respect. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp evening air. My Blacktown car was waiting, idling quietly at the end of the gravel driveway. The driver opened the rear door as I approached. I slid into the luxurious leather seat, the soft hum of the engine wrapping around me like a shield. Take me home, I instructed quietly. The car pulled away from the country club, leaving the flashing lights and the shattered remnants of my former family far behind in the darkness. 6 months later, the winter chill had completely thawed, replaced by a bright, unforgiving spring that brought absolute clarity to the new world order. The morning bell in the Federal Correctional Institution rings at exactly 5 in the morning. It is a harsh, metallic clang that offers zero negotiation and respects no authority. Gabby wakes up on a thin, lumpy mattress that smells faintly of industrial bleach and stale sweat. She sits up in the cramped concrete cell, her hands resting on her knees. The woman who once spent 3 hours every morning coordinating $1,000 tailored suits and screaming at terrified paralegals now wears an oversized, deeply faded khaki jumpsuit. There are no power lunches here. There are no regional judges to charm. During the mandatory mail call, a guard tosses a plain white envelope onto Gabby's plastic lunch tray. She rips it open with trembling fingers. It is the final official notice from the State Bar Association. Her law license has been permanently revoked. She is no longer an elite corporate attorney. She is simply inmate 84792, tasked with scrubbing the cafeteria floors for 14 cents an hour. When she tries to order another inmate to take her shift, claiming she has a migraine, the response is a sharp, humiliating laugh and a shove that sends Gabby stumbling backward into a mop bucket. She spends the rest of her afternoon weeping silently in a supply closet, completely stripped of her teeth and her title. Miles away, the fluorescent lights of a dying suburban mall buzz with a relentless, annoying hum. Connor adjusts the collar of a cheap, stiff polyester polo shirt. He stands behind the cash register of a discount menswear outlet, mindlessly rearranging a display of Argyle socks. The slick, untouchable financial executive who once laundered millions through offshore accounts now holds a name tag pinned to his chest that reads trainee. The bell above the glass door chimes. Connor instinctively plasters on a desperate retail smile, looking up to greet the customer. His blood instantly runs cold. Walking through the door is a former junior analyst from Vanguard Financial, a young man Connor used to verbally abuse and humiliate on a daily basis. The young man stops, his eyes widening, as he takes in Connor's cheap uniform and the clearance signs hanging from the ceiling. Connor's face flushes a deep, burning crimson. He tries to stammer out an explanation, claiming it is just a temporary transition, a brief stepping stone, while he consults on private portfolios. But the young man does not argue. He simply looks at Connor with an expression of profound, devastating pity, turns on his heel, and walks out of the store. Connor leans heavily against the cash register, the absolute crushing weight of his permanent banishment from the finance industry breaking him right there in the shoe aisle. The eviction of my parents was a masterpiece of clinical efficiency. My holding company executed the foreclosure protocols on the Fairfield estate with zero delays and absolute legal precision. They were given exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises. Vivian sobbed hysterically on the grand staircase, frantically shoving her expensive furs and designer handbags into cheap brown cardboard boxes purchased from a local hardware store. They now live in a cramped 600-square-foot apartment located directly adjacent to a busy, deafening interstate highway. The walls are paper-thin and the carpets carry permanent, unidentifiable stains. Roland sits in a cheap fabric recliner all day, staring blankly at a small television screen. He has no country club to hold court in. He has no staff to command. He goes to a local diner, attempts to bypass the line by demanding a private table, and the teenage hostess simply rolls her eyes and hands him a plastic buzzer. He is a broke, bitter ghost of a man. Vivian's societal exile is even more brutal. She attempts to maintain her dignity by wearing her oversized sunglasses to a discount grocery store. While aggressively digging through a bin of marked-down produce, she spots two women who previously served alongside her on an elite charity committee. Vivian instantly stands up straight, pasting on her most aristocratic smile, preparing to wave. Before she can even raise her hand, the two women lock eyes with her, their expressions freezing into masks of absolute disgust. They sharply turn their shopping carts around and practically jog down the opposite aisle, treating Vivian like a walking contagion. She stands alone in the frozen food section, the absolute reality of her complete social annihilation finally sinking in. The morning sun beats down bright and warm, casting a brilliant glow over the heart of my old neighborhood. We are standing on the very street my parents abandoned the second they tasted a moderate sliver of manufactured wealth. But the block is no longer forgotten. I am standing on a wide wooden stage, the warm breeze catching the fabric of my tailored emerald suit. I am holding a pair of massive gold-plated ceremonial scissors. Stretched across the entrance of the sprawling, sleek building behind me is a vibrant blue ribbon. The structure is a masterpiece of modern architecture, utilizing massive panes of glass and repurposed industrial steel to create a beacon of pure innovation. Shining in bold silver lettering above the main entrance is the name of the facility. The Loretta Youth Tech Academy. My holding company funded the entire project. It is a completely debt-free, state-of-the-art campus featuring advanced coding labs, artificial intelligence servers, and full-scale robotics workshops. I am surrounded by the only people who truly matter. Malik stands to my right, clapping loudly, a massive, genuine smile breaking across his usually stoic face. My legal team, my board of directors, and the authentic, brilliant partners who helped me scale my company from a tiny apartment to a global empire flank the stage. But the most important people are standing right in front of me. The crowd is overflowing with local Black youth, their faces bright, eager, and buzzing with electric potential. They are holding tablets pointing at the building, ready to walk through those doors and actively build the future. I look out over the cheering crowd, and a profound, perfect peace washes over my entire spirit. I think about that crumpled $20 an hour receptionist flyer Gabby shoved into my chest. I think about Roland sitting at his country club table, pounding his fist, and calling me a failure because I refused to subscribe to his archaic, toxic definition of success. They worshipped the illusion of wealth. They valued the appearance of power over actual substance, and they happily sacrificed their morals, their freedom, and their own family just to keep the paint from peeling off their fake lives. Big Mama saw through every single layer of their deception. She planted a financial seed in my hands because she knew I possessed the patience, the intellect, and the genuine grit required to grow a forest. I did not just survive their emotional abuse and their relentless condescension, I weaponized it. I utilized every insult as a brick to build an impenetrable fortress. I turned my status as the family scapegoat into the ultimate tactical advantage operating in the shadows until I had amassed enough power to completely eclipse the sun. I grip the handles of the heavy gold scissors. The crowd begins to chant, counting down from 5. They told me I would never measure up. They told me I would never have a seat at their prestigious, exclusive table. They demanded I lower my head, shrink my ambitions, and beg for the scraps they felt gracious enough to drop. I snap the blades together, slicing cleanly through the thick blue ribbon. The crowd erupts into a deafening, joyous roar that echoes down the city blocks. I hand the scissors to Malik and look up at the shining silver letters of Big Mama's name. The ultimate realization settles into my bones with cold, unyielding precision. I never needed a seat at their table. I was too busy buying the entire building. The ultimate lesson is that your worth is never defined by those who underestimate you, even toxic family. When treated as a scapegoat, it's easy to internalize their cruelty. But true power comes from knowing your value, setting firm boundaries, and refusing to play their games. You don't need a seat at a table that disrespects you. You can build your own empire instead. Sometimes the greatest revenge is simply reclaiming your peace and achieving monumental success on your own terms. Have you ever walked away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story below and subscribe today.